Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the 27th Annual National Security Law Conference here at Duke Law School. And I'm very pleased to introduce the next panel, or at least the moderator of the next panel, David Hoffman, my friend of many years, a longtime supporter of Lens. In fact, I'm counting you on the Lens staff practically. He works here, but also over at Sanford, and has put together a really interesting panel of people. And I'm looking forward to this discussion. And David, I'll turn it over to you.
Charlie, thanks. And it is such a pleasure to be here in person again and to have people here for the Lens Conference. As I tell all of our students how lucky they are to be able to attend the Lens Conference. I think it's absolutely the premier national security law conference in the country. And it's a real honor to be able to participate and to work with Charlie and Professor Stansbury in the planning for it. I'm very excited about this particular panel because I think we are going to dig into some of the most interesting and exciting developments that are happening in cybersecurity law and how the country is responding to a lot of the cybersecurity threats. So let me start, though, by introducing the panelists. I want to start by introducing Caroline Brown, who is a partner at Crowell & Mooring in DC and a member of the firm's National Security Practice Group. Also, prior to that, served at the U.S. Department of Justice in the National Security Division, where worked on counterespionage, cybersecurity, counterterrorism, and I believe participated in the CFIUS and Team Telecom. But prior to that, served at Treasury in two different roles. Served within the FinCEN organization, developing an in-depth understanding of anti-money laundering laws, and before that, in the Office of General Counsel at the Treasury Department. And Caroline has a law degree from Georgetown, and then the most important part of the resume, a law degree from Michigan, and the most important, an undergraduate degree from Duke University. Next online, so Carl is unmasked, is Carl Gaddis. Carl is a senior vice president with Booz Allen's Justice, Homeland, and Transportation business. He previously led E&Y's government and public sector cyber practice. Prior to that, he spent 21 years at the FBI, and as the culminating experience of those 21 years was the executive assistant director of the National Security Branch, where he directed the agency's efforts in counterterrorism, counterintelligence, and addressing the risk from weapons of mass destruction. Carl has a law degree from Washington University in St. Louis, and also an undergraduate degree from Duke University. Thanks, Carl, for being here. And Christopher Steed has also joined us. Chris is the Chief Investment Officer at Paladin Capital and also the Managing Director. Currently leads the development and implementation of the firm's multi-stage national security-related investment strategy, particularly in Paladin's global IT and cybersecurity portfolios. Previously, he worked at Merrill Lynch in their private banking and investment group with ultra high net worth division and with clients. And Chris also is has an undergraduate degree from Duke University. So this is our all Duke University panel, because I am also a graduate from Duke University here at the law school. Let's dig into this. There's a lot of substance that we want to explore. I want to start by setting the stage that a few years ago, I was here at the Lens Conference and had the opportunity to observe Ben Wittes leading a panel and discussing a book that he had recently come out with called The Future of Violence. Ben is a leader at the think tank of Brookings and was also co-authoring this book with Gabriella Blum, who's a Harvard law professor. The main point of the book was to posit that with advances in technology, what was rapidly happening across a number of different domains is that it was much easier for a small number of people to be able to exact violence on a large number of people. for a very small cost and potential investment. And one of the domains that he explored in that book was cybersecurity. I think in the years that have followed, we've seen that that dynamic has been done nothing but increase. But the message that came from the book was not one of just noting the risk and the problem, but also for noting the potential solution. And that solution was that if the risk was going to come from a more diffuse group of actors, that the response to that risk also needed to come from a more diffuse group of actors, particularly that government was not going to be able to adequately address that risk themselves, and more, we had to create structures so that government and the private sector could collaborate to address those risks. So in this panel, we really want to focus on that collaboration and the different roles between the private sector and government, the degree to which it can help address the risks, but also then the other issues that that creates by having government and the private sector collaborate. So to allow us to dig in, I wanted to, Chris, see if you could kick us off, particularly when we're talking about the private sector, we're trying to talk about bringing capital to bear to address these kinds of risks. How do you see these issues being explored and developing from a capital investment perspective?
No, absolutely. It's a great question, and thank you for having me here. It's a real pleasure to be here. And so the way that we look at the problem is that private and public sector collaboration right now, there's never been a more important time for it to occur. We have vast majority of U.S. and global critical infrastructure that is owned and operated by the private sector. Yet, those private sector operators do not have the type of defense-grade tools in order to protect themselves against the diversity of threats and the dynamic threats that are shaping how we look at cyberspace and our security posture in cyberspace. And so as we've developed an investment strategy at Paladin Capital Group, which started in 2001 primarily as a response to the attacks on 9/11, and it was a private sector response to those attacks, trying to bring best-of-breed technologies from the defense-grade world and the military world and government world that were built with security centricity mindsets over to the commercial sector. And at the same time, looking at the commercial sector where ease of use, cost efficiencies, and high levels of scalability really reign supreme over to the government world. And so we invest explicitly at the intersection point between those two concepts. Now, for many early stage companies that we look at, and we are a venture capital investor, what they acknowledge is that government, while it can mandate and it can regulate and it can enforce as much as they can on how the private sector can defend critical infrastructure, these private sector owners and operators are still running businesses. They're in it to try to generate profit. They need to cut costs. They adopt new technologies, and digital transformation is only growing exponentially. And so while they can and need to adopt these new technologies, we see a world going forward in which public and private sector collaboration is only going to increase with more mandates, more regulation for what they need to do in order to protect not only our nation, but our allies. And for the last 75 years, the U.S. has enjoyed an information advantage since the beginning or since the end of World War II. That innovation advantage and that playing field has now leveled out. And so as we look not only internally at the U.S., we also need to look externally at our international partners to try to bring those best-of-breed technologies to bear. Cyberspace really has no boundary. Cyberspace really doesn't have a geography. A 16-year-old in some remote part of the world can download a do-it-yourself DDoS kit and take down a global financial services firm for the cost of $20. That level of asymmetry between what it takes to defend your critical infrastructure with tens of millions of dollars versus what it takes to attack requires more public sector and private sector collaboration and investment. And we're beginning to see the money flow over the last 5 to 10 years, both from the private sector in terms of private equity, venture capital, new startup ideas, research labs, government grants. There's a lot that's going out there that's helping, but we still need more. And more, as we begin to see the evolution of cyberspace, we're beginning to see individuals that come out of government that used to be cyber operators now wanting to work in the private sector because they understand that the private sector is actually on the front lines. And then is it appropriate for a small or even a large business to be able to defend themselves against a nation state that may otherwise want to target other nations with military-like tools? And so for us, we need to bring individuals out of government into the commercial sector, and at the same time, we're beginning to see the vast flow of those entrepreneurs that have been working in cybersecurity for large organizations saying, enough is enough. We're losing this fight. My private sector company can't spend enough, can't bring in enough talent in order to defend itself, and so I'm going to bring my innovation expertise over to government. And so again, I cannot stress enough the importance of not just collaboration between capital outlay, but collaboration between the people and the ideas for how we go about defending the nation as a whole and defending our allies as a whole. One of the terms of art that I use is the arsenal of democracy. And that was a term that was originally coined by FDR pre-U.S. entry into World War II. And what it was meant to say is that we here in the U.S. haven't entered that conflict yet, but what we can do is do something good, and we can make a buck doing it too. By moving to a wartime mindset, to a wartime concept, taking things like the Ford Auto Factory and starting to develop warplanes that we could ship over to Europe so our allies could defend themselves and then be ready when the conflict came to us. And when we entered that conflict, we were already on wartime footing with our industrial systems ready to go. And so for the future forward, as we look at capital formation and allocation strategies, we're looking at that bridge between that government world and that private sector world to defend the nation as a whole, defend cyberspace, and make it a trusted ecosystem that everyone can use. Thank you, David.
Thank you. Chris, that was a fantastic description, I think, of the opportunity that we have to address this. Carolyn, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the complexities that it creates when we've got the public sector and the private sector collaborating like this with national security, and some of the concerns that we have from a national security perspective about the private sector in other countries, possibly.
Sure, absolutely. So I'm going to take a similar theme to what Chris just talked about, and that's investment and money and the role that it's playing in protecting our nation's infrastructure against cybersecurity threats. So I come at this from a unique perspective, having sat in government for many, many years working on these issues. And there, as David described, I wore a couple of different hats. So I worked on some operations, I worked on regulations, right? And so I got to kind of figure out, what do we want the private sector to do? What are we going to require that they do? Now that I'm back in private practice, I'm working with companies to help them comply with the very things that I helped put in place and see exactly what are these headaches, what are the problems, what are the issues that companies have with compliance with these regs, and also have a better insight about what are the challenges that they're facing. How can they share that information with government so that government can augment the requirements, the regulations, and make it more efficient so that we can all kind of work together to combat this threat. So the first thing I want to talk about are how we do that through controls over investment. And that's through two mechanisms. One is CFIUS, which you're probably all familiar with. The other is a lesser known entity called Team Telecom, right? So FIRMA, which was the legislation that significantly overhauled CFIUS a couple of years ago, was very focused on addressing the cybersecurity threat and put in place various requirements for companies to report transactions that would expose different vulnerabilities to entities that could take advantage of the opportunity to invest in companies and position themselves either to have access to sensitive information or control or insight into critical infrastructure. And so that's something that CFIUS has been very focused on over the past couple of years. There's obviously, different vulnerabilities that can come up in a variety of different ways when you're talking about investments in U.S. companies. One is, direct investments in U.S. cybersecurity firms. That's kind of the obvious one. The next is investments that would allow entities to gain access to critical technologies and non-public sensitive information. And then another one is investments that would allow access to sensitive information or PII or national security information that would obviously compromise different operations of the United States. And so CFIUS has been very active in reviewing these transactions and working with these companies either to make them really assess, okay, who are your buyers? Who are your investors? Do you really know who's looking at your company as far as acquisitions. And then it also works with them on various mitigation plans, right? And so a lot of these deals that end up going through are subject to national security agreements or mitigation agreements where they have to sign on to different cybersecurity plans to protect the very information that is vulnerable to exploitation. The other thing that I mentioned that I want to focus on a little bit is Team Telecom. So Team Telecom has also been subject to significant reform over the past couple of years. There was an executive order that came out last April that overhauled this entity. This also operates very similar to CFIUS in that it can review certain investments in telecom infrastructure. One of the things that it can review that people don't really realize is undersea cables. And these are the cables that connect the United States to other points within the world and through which all data flows beneath. Obviously, this creates significant vulnerabilities for all the data that's going through those connections and those connection points. There was a deal that Team Telecom recommended blocking this past year that involved major technology players and a cable that would have connected the west coast of the United States to points of entry in both China and in various connection points. And then the last thing I want to talk about is not just investment mechanisms, but supply chain. So there's a lot of different tools that the United States has reformed over the past several years that's forcing companies to really scrub their supply chains and better understand who are their vendors, who are their customers, who are their suppliers. And you've probably heard a lot about these, been in the news a lot. One is Section 889, which addresses different telecommunication suppliers. The other one is export controls. So the export controls has really ramped up over the past several years, specifically focusing on telecommunication providers and the dialogue that's going on with Huawei. And then the third is also sanctions, right? And so we're hearing a lot about that this week, and we can talk about that a little bit later. But how the United States is using sanctions to also identify those players that are looking to exploit different vulnerabilities, different cyber actors as well. And I'll leave it there.
Great, thanks, Caroline. Carl, both in the role that the roles that you had at the FBI and in the work that you've been doing at E&Y and at Booz Allen, my guess is that you've had the opportunity to be on both sides of public-private collaboration, particularly in the area of cybersecurity. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about where you've seen the real value that's been created.
Yeah, thank you, David. Thank you for inviting me here. And I have to say the timing of this conference couldn't be more perfect given the events in the Ukraine, Eastern Europe, given the events that are happening in the cybersecurity world. And this conversation is obviously very timely as well. I think it's worth pulling the camera back a little bit and taking a look at how we got to this point and why our journey to this point has necessitated this public-private relationship, and beyond that, even a global relationship. When I was running the national security branch at the FBI and I was working in the national security matters, I saw a lot of our adversaries increasingly taking more and more advantage of the cyberspace battlefield, if you will. And your comments, when you were talking about Ben Wittes's comments, they're right on point. In terms of some of the actors that we observed back in 2014, 15, and so forth. And it reminded me of the way that ISIS developed their sophisticated tactics and their techniques and their practices in the cyber realm. And they were one of the more sophisticated terrorist groups that took advantage of cyberspace as a battlefield. So obviously we were engaged on the physical battlefield with ISIS. But ISIS became increasingly more and more sophisticated in moving the fight from the physical battlefield to the cyber battlefield. And they use that cyber battlefield to recruit individuals to come and be a part of ISIS, to identify targets that ISIS operatives would go after, to spread their propaganda across the cyberspace arena. So they were very effective in using cyber as a tool in their war in Iraq. And so the United States government had to become more and more increasingly sophisticated in terms of how we responded to those tactics and how we mitigated the threat posed by ISIS. We also saw counterintelligence targets taking advantage of cyberspace. nation state actors and actors that were acting on behalf of those nation states. And again, they used cyberspace to attack the United States in a number of different ways. They tried to recruit some of our personnel in the United States. They tried to infiltrate our networks, both on the commercial side and the government side, to steal our secrets, to steal our PII, to steal our intellectual capital, and to target us, again, in a cyber battlefield without any sort of physical presence in the United States. So we saw this maturation and this sophistication on a number of different actors in those realms, counterterrorism and espionage. And so the United States government had to, as I said, become more and more sophisticated in terms of identifying these actors, disrupting these actors, going after their individuals, and also going after their networks, their architectural networks, and making sure that we were taking the fight beyond the physical battle space to the cyber battle space. And when you look at the actors here in the United States that took part in that effort, it wasn't just the FBI, it wasn't just the CIA or NSA or Cyber Command, it was all of us. It was the entire intelligence community. And so we realized, just like we did after 9/11, that we are stronger as a united force than we are as individuals. And one of the reasons that is because, first and foremost, all of the members of the intelligence community, including the DoD, have different authorities that they apply to this particular effort, to this fight. And so as a united front, we were able to leverage each one of our different authorities to the detriment of the adversaries. We were also putting ourselves in a position to not just collect intelligence, but to share that intelligence among the intelligence community, and even more broadly with the Five Eyes and other nations across the globe that were our allies. And so again, that united front was very beneficial and gave us leverage that we wouldn't have otherwise had as individual agencies and departments. As, again, our adversaries and other nation states continued to gain in terms of sophistication in cyberspace, we also realized that this was not just a government effort, that we needed to involve the private sector. And as Chris mentioned earlier, the private sector owns about 95% of the technical infrastructure and the networks throughout this country. And so, A, they're going to be impacted by malicious actors before the government is likely to be impacted. And secondly, those private entities are likely to know about those intrusions, those breaches, those ransomware efforts prior to the government knowing about them. And so from an impact and intelligence perspective, the government had to bring in private entities into that fight against these adversaries. And obviously for a number of reasons, not just for intelligence collection reasons, but also to protect these commercial companies as they were being attacked in cyberspace, and to make sure that the intelligence community was collecting and synthesizing and analyzing the intelligence from these attacks, whether they be ransomware attacks or other types of malicious or destructive attacks. Obviously, needing to know that intelligence is very important. We needed to identify the actors. We needed to identify their techniques, their tactics, their practices, and we needed to devise ways to disrupt them in cyberspace and to impose risks and consequences in cyberspace. Sometimes those risks and consequences included indictments, arrests. Other times they included other types of offensive cyber capabilities that other agencies had. So there were a variety of tools at our disposal to be used against these adversaries. But what we needed was the collaboration and the cooperation of the private sector to be able to make sure that we had the right intelligence, that we understood the actors, their intentions, and how they affected their ultimate goals on these networks. And so that's one of the main reasons that relationship was important. But we also realized that some of these corporations were global corporations. So they were impacted across the world. That impact also had impact on other countries, on other governments, on other intelligence and law enforcement services. So our efforts had to go beyond just uniting as an intelligence community. We had to go beyond uniting the private and the public sector. We also had to make an effort to bring in other law enforcement and intelligence services into the fight. And we also had to make an effort to bring in other countries and other tools and authorities that they had. And so we talked about the intelligence community. We talked about needing to have the Department of State working with us, the Department of Treasury to bring their authorities with us, and other countries who could potentially have reach in areas that the FBI or other intelligence community agencies couldn't have reach into. So this became and is still becoming a global effort. So we're very much focused here inside the United States on cooperation between intel community partners, but we need to focus also not just on intel community partners, but on partnerships with the private sector, on partnerships with global corporations overseas, with other countries abroad, and with other law enforcement intelligence services abroad. And that's going to be an effective way to not just identify the adversaries, but to mitigate the risk they pose.
Carl, thank you very much. And I want to drill down a little bit, maybe have the entire panel comment on a couple of things. I think Chris talked about global investment. Caroline, you mentioned some of the issues that the country has to confront when dealing with companies outside of the United States, particularly who are going to participate in critical infrastructure or the telecommunications network. And Carl, you noting these global dynamics. I'm wondering a bit, maybe Chris, if you could kick us off and talk about when we're looking at trying to find the best innovations to help with government missions, whether that could be offensive cyber attacks, whether that could be assistance with surveillance, or whether it could be defensive by nature and helping to protect critical infrastructure or government systems and national security systems. Is this a global environment where we should be looking to invest and bring technologies and companies and services to the United States to help?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll also answer that just by example. We have two investments in Estonia. And you look at the history of Estonia and the conflict that they had already gone through in cyberspace in the early 90s when their electricity grid was taken down. They developed a level of competency there, a level of education, of policy, of law that was able to bring new technologies to bear that could help to not only build their digital infrastructure, but then to start to export those technologies. And so for a place like Estonia, where it is geographically and geopolitically right now, it is really important that we continue to reach out and try to build arsenals of democracy, not just in the US, but abroad. This is a shared ecosystem and a shared environment of technologies that do need to be protected. And if one goes down, the interdependencies in cyberspace result in many other systems going down. You look at 16, 17 critical infrastructure verticals here in the US, by definition abroad, there's 60, 70, 80 different types of verticals of critical infrastructure, all with their different types of systems, different owners, different operators, different pieces of software that are running on them. And so we must bring to bear these individuals that want to do good. They want to defend democracy. They want to defend free society. And they're already doing it in those nations where they have been supported or have suffered some of the most critical attacks that we've seen in cyberspace. And so these types of investments and these types of collaborative models, only need to get stronger. We do have the Five Eyes. I mean, between the US, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and the UK, there's tons of investment opportunity. The United Kingdom, I think, has been the furthest forward in trying to push policy for cyber innovation, 12 cyber centers of excellence across the university systems there. The establishment of the National Cybersecurity Center, where their formal mantra is cybersecurity for the public good. And so we must continue to look outside of the U.S. to bring these collaborators in, not just from a physical standpoint, but into the design cycle for the supply chain. Caroline talked about the supply chain, how important it is. Well, the supply chain, particularly for the U.S. government, that's 50, 60,000 really small companies. You've got your defense contractors, you've got your primes, but the vast majority of the companies that service those U.S. government needs are really small companies, most of which operate in the defense industrial base without access to innovation, even in other parts of the U.S. And so bringing our foreign counterparts in to do cyber exercises, to bring new technologies. I mean, even In-Q-Tel now has offices abroad. And the In-Q-Tel, for those that don't know, it's essentially the venture capital arm of the U.S. intel community. And so being able to actually take advantage of those efforts with private sector capital and collaboration, building these technologies in the private sector where commercial competitiveness results in them being built better, more cost effectively, and more efficiently, and then delivering them back to global governments so that we can have a common operating platform to defend ourselves.
Caroline, I'm wondering if you could comment a little bit more. You spoke a little bit about this in your opening remarks about it, if there is real value to be obtained by engaging with these folks who want to do good no matter what country they are in. What kind of guardrails do we need to put in, or and to what degree does existing law create the right structures for us to be able to protect ourselves as a country in that environment?
Let me take that in reverse order. So I think what we see with some of the export controls, with some of these, these other, we'll call them trade controls, right, that are directing companies, okay, these are the parameters in which you have to work, right? That's the government having already established a basis for suggesting that there are certain companies, there are certain components that we just don't trust, that we don't want in our ecosystem, and we're not going to let you have them. And if you do, there is a penalty for them, right? So once it's gotten to that stage, you've already gotten, the US government has already done its homework, right? It's already collected its intelligence, it already knows what it's dealing with, and it said, this is not coming into our supply chain, and companies, you have to comply with that. That sometimes, and this is not directly on point with your question, David, but I think it's worth highlighting, sometimes that puts companies in a real predicament, right? If they don't have other providers, they don't have other sources, what are they supposed to do with their end products? How are they going to come up with those components if there's not enough of that supply, right? And so this is when there's opportunity for dialogue with the government to say, hey, we want to do what's right for national security, for economic security. We're on the same team here, but you've got to help us because we're in a real tough spot here. A great example of that is with semiconductors, right? With the chips right now. There's, a tremendous amount of effort to reshore, to onshore that technology back to the United States. That puts a lot of companies, when they're reevaluating their supply chains and they're trying to diversify, what their sources are, that's becoming difficult. It's not becoming, it is difficult for a lot of companies who are trying to do the right thing, but at the end of the day, they still have supply orders they need to fill. So that's an example of how some of these things, even though everyone's trying to do the right thing, it makes it very difficult for companies to figure out a path forward without further direction from the government. Whether it's there's Title III funding or additional fundings or subsidies from the government that would offset that, that's one way, but there's never enough money to help private industry kind of find their way around some of these regulations that can be quite overwhelming.
Carl, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about something that Caroline's touching on there, which is sort of the complexity of making some of this collaboration operational. Going and working with the government. I think that Booz Allen does this all of the time, and it strikes me as not being an easy thing to navigate.
You're right, David. It is not. And I've seen it from both sides, as you indicated. I've seen it from the government side for many years, and I've seen it now from private industry for many years, specifically on the consulting side. You talk about, you've all used the word investment a number of times. And in my view, there are two key areas there this country needs to invest to ensure that the government network infrastructure is secure. The first is people, and the second is quite literally money. Let me get the budgetary issues first, and that is probably the biggest challenge that the United States government faces in terms of securing its technical infrastructure. And it's probably one of our biggest challenges on the consulting side in helping the government make sure that its network infrastructure is up to standards and is secure. A number of the federal agencies, for example, that I work with, a vast majority, a large portion of their budget is devoted to things like paying personnel, leasing or renting space, owning space, maintaining physical structures, purchasing vehicles, purchasing equipment. A small portion of the budget is then left to be devoted to some other discretionary items like cybersecurity, like network infrastructure. And so that small piece of the pie is often neglected because of these budgetary constraints. And so when you have that situation come up year after year, what you see is network infrastructures that are not up to date, that are not secure, that are not patched, that are not on the cloud, and that are very vulnerable. Each year, these infrastructures become more and more vulnerable. The networks become more and more vulnerable if investments aren't made to bring them up to date and protect them. That becomes even more challenging when you have situations like we have now, which is we are under a continuing resolution. The government is under a continuing resolution. So that even increases the budgetary limitations on these federal agencies. So oftentimes they're just using their budget literally to keep the lights on and to keep operating on a day-to-day basis. They don't have the financial wherewithal to take care of their network infrastructure the way they need to do it. The second area, as I said, is people. And that is people. By that I mean people in the government and also people outside of the government who charged with the responsibility to help those federal government clients with their network infrastructure. So let me talk a little bit about people inside the government. When you're talking about cybersecurity, we're talking about the need to have people in, for example, the FBI or CISA or in other critical components who are very sophisticated when it comes to cybersecurity and who understand the cybersecurity environment and the cybersecurity battle space. These are our folks on the front lines of the cybersecurity war. And so as a government, there is a need to make sure that these individuals are properly trained and trained ahead of the adversary, because the adversaries are very sophisticated here, whether they're hacktivists or nation state actors. They understand cybersecurity warfare and they're very good at it. So we need special agents in the FBI and folks in NSA, CIA, and other intel components to exceed that level of sophistication, to be more sophisticated and more adept at working in the cybersecurity environment than our adversaries, so that they understand how to collect intelligence, how to identify the actors, how to disrupt the networks, how to follow the money online. They need to understand cryptocurrency. They need to understand ransomware. And that level of understanding has to be very detailed. And so we need to recruit the right type of people, make sure we educate those people and retain them. Retention is a significant issue in the government because once these individuals are trained, they become very marketable. And the market right now is very good on the commercial side. So what you see is folks in the government who receive this type of training, who have high levels of classification, clearances, who are able to go and take that experience into the private sector. And the financial draw in the private sector is rather significant. And so there is that talent drain. Now, on the private side, specifically with consulting companies, we have similar issues. We are trying to help these clients make sure that their networks are secure, make sure that they are properly transitioning to secure cloud environments, for example. But we understand that our clients are hampered by budgetary considerations, not the least of which is something like the continuing resolution that we're under now. And so it makes it that much more difficult for us to help them navigate and make their way through this journey to where they need to be in terms of having a secure network infrastructure. We also have personnel resource issues because we hire very highly skilled, technically skilled people with engineering degrees, for example, software engineering degrees and so forth, who have clearances and who have a significant amount of experience working with federal agencies. And so oftentimes they are also influenced by how good the market is. And so we also need to make sure that we are able to retain that talent so that we can satisfy the needs of our clients. So our problems mirror the problems of our client. And as I said, it boils down to money and it boils down to our people, our talent.
Well, on both of those topics, Carl, on money and workforce development and the talent issue, this leads me to the question I want to open up to all members of the panel. And then after this, I want to take questions from the audience. Charlie, do we have a way to take questions from folks online also?
Yes, they can email them to the dedicated email address. And I will bring them to your attention.
Great. So anybody online, if you want to send questions in to the email address and then on the agenda, please do that. And folks in the room, after this question, we'll take questions that you have. So my question is, and Chris, I know you worked for years with Chris Inglis, who's now the National Cyber Director. And I'm wondering on these issues around investment and talent, I'm wondering if all three of you on the panel could address, what would you recommend to Mr. Inglis that the government should do to foster the right public-private collaboration that would help take care of some of those issues?
So I'm happy to jump in. I think dialogue, is really important. I mean, we have been saying, and Carl, you hit it, I think, right on the head in terms of the people problem. I mean, we've been saying for 15 years that there are millions and millions of unfilled jobs in cybersecurity. I mean, and for most of those jobs, actually, they're non-technical jobs, and they really are. And so for so much of what we need to do is try to reduce the barrier to entry for people to want to enter the cybersecurity workforce, whether that points them towards the legal realm, whether that points them towards policy, whether it points them towards being a business operator that simply knows a little bit more about cybersecurity than the next person over. And so my recommendation is continuing to invest not only in early education, but continuing in education, and then looking at vocational programs. I mean, for a sophisticated cyber operator going into the private sector, yeah, they can fetch 150, 250, sometimes $500,000 a year or more. But what about those lower level jobs? And what about those individuals that will go through 2 or 3 year programs that are specifically directed at that vocational program of cybersecurity and the various different parts of that ecosystem? Again, it doesn't have to be technical, but it can be vocational. And there are so many jobs that remain unfilled because most people that would otherwise enter cybersecurity don't, because they don't think they either have the technical skills or the know-how. I mean, cybersecurity is a very, very dense subject. It's a very hard one to understand from the outside looking in. And so my recommendation to Chris, and it's something that we talked about for years, is in and around cyber workforce development. It's a problem that we've been trying to crack. We've done it a couple of different ways by simply trying to educate, let's say, employees inside of an organization to better understand the difference between a phishing attack and a real email, looking at trying to create your employees as human sensors in your environment, reporting bad things before they get into your more critical assets. And so more of a dialogue needs to continue to occur. And it's not just between the private sector and the public sector. I mean, it needs to happen at home. Cyber hygiene and things like cyber safety are now coming to the forefront. Digital literacy needs to be pushed out across the curriculums of early education programs. We look at cybersecurity ecosystems as one in which you're defending things and data and networks and systems. But at the end of the day, what about the people? And now that cyberspace has become a domain where conflict occurs, people are becoming collateral damage. And so we've got to figure out better ways to keep people safe in cyberspace, at the same time protecting cyberspace itself, and then having more individuals come in with an ever better knowledge of what it means to be a good digital citizen and a safe and trusted digital citizen.
Thanks, Chris. Caroline, thoughts you want to share with Chris Inglis? We'll pass them along.
Sure, of course. Well, I'll limit this to the government workforce because I think Carl touched on something about the turnover within government, how, the jobs that are outside of government are quite lucrative and quite enticing. And so what government is constantly facing is how do you keep a talent pool in the ranks, right? Because there's so many incentives to take what you've learned, take that skill set and make some money off of it. The people that are in government a lot of them are there for mission, right? They really believe in the mission. I was there for the mission. It's incredibly rewarding, the sort of work that you do in government. I think you really start to reduce the incentives for staying in government when you denigrate the government workforce. So I would say that that's something that leadership, that the private sector, that everybody needs to really be aware of, is that you need talent in government, you want talent in government. And the further that you start to, if morale is decreased for whatever reason, you're really putting the national security of the nation at risk because you're creating even more incentives for them to find employment elsewhere outside of the United States government.
Carl, thoughts on what you would like to see Director Inglis do?
I think when we talk about collaboration between private industry and the government, we've been talking about exchange of information. We've been talking about cooperation in terms of prosecutions and protecting PII, turning over records and discovery and so forth. What we haven't been talking about is how collectively the government and private industry can tackle this problem of our talent workforce. And in the way we look at it now, it's either you're working for the government or you're working for private industry. Never the twain shall meet. And perhaps we should look at a different model, a more bold model, a hybrid model, where instead of private industry taking the talent away from government, or even vice versa, because that happens as well, oftentimes because of the mission, as Caroline said, that is the draw for the government. But perhaps we should talk about an exchange of talent to make sure that government and private industry are both invested in the solution, and that private industry is invested not just from a personnel perspective, but from a financial perspective. And so that private industry can help with those salaries where there are government limitations, and perhaps allow someone who is working for the government in the cyber arena to work for the government for a few years, and then after those few years, do some type of a rotation in private industry, maintain their security clearances. Obviously, you would have some concerns about that, and there would be other issues that we could overcome, but allow those folks to go out into the commercial sector and get that experience and get that financial bump, if you will, that they otherwise wouldn't have in government, and then go back to government. So government wouldn't completely lose the talent. The private industry would benefit from having government talent working for them for a number of years, because they know those resources have developed skills within the government, have reached back within the government. And so they could also serve to sort of bridge that divide and those areas where there is lack of trust between private industry and government. And so there are ways to think boldly about this problem and come up with this solution that benefits both private industry and government and the individual, who both wants to make sure that they are financially secure during the course of a career, but also wants to contribute to a righteous mission. The other area is that I think government can do more to train its personnel. Government can do more to utilize academia, for example, to provide this type of cutting edge training, cyber training, that agents in the FBI, for example, need, that folks at CISA need, that folks at the NSA need, to keep up with what the adversary is learning and what the adversary is doing online. So I think there could be other ways where there could be collaboration between government and academia and even the private sector to better educate the personnel that work in government.
Carl, thanks. That's really helpful. And I do think I want to pursue a couple of those themes, but first I want to see, do we have questions online, Charles?
One question, actually it's my question. It's really for Carl, but anybody on the panel. I like the idea of thinking boldly about personnel issues, but I do worry you take somebody from government, you put them in private industry. I don't know how you get them back, because especially if the differential in pay is so graphic in this area. Is there a way of solving that? Should we have bonuses or something for government personnel?
Carl, could you hear that question from General Dunlap?
I could not, David. If you could repeat it, that'd be great.
Or Charlie, I'll repeat it. General Dunlap's question was a concern. It was a concern that if we followed that hybrid model, that we'd have great difficulty getting the folks back into government service after moving over to do private sector employment. And I'm wondering, are there things that you think that could help encourage that?
Yeah, I think so. I think, one, you would need to incentivize that move for that particular individual. And so what you could offer for that individual who, for example, is working in government, but wants to improve their skills by getting an advanced degree, a master's degree, for example, a PhD, or certain certifications that would help them become a better cyber investigator or cyber analyst, whatever the case may be. They could leave for a period of time from government, and private industry could fund that learning effort. And in exchange, the individual could then work for that particular private industry company for a period of years. But part of the broader agreement would be that that individual would have to come back to government. So essentially, you would have an agreement between the individual and the government and the private entity that would give them an opportunity to undertake the training, give them an opportunity to work for private industry, but also impose upon them the obligation to return to government after a certain period of time. So after that period of time, they would come back to government with the advanced degree that they wanted, potentially in a better financial situation than they were when they left government. And you would also have an individual who is essentially a happier employee because they were able to align their own personal goals, their own personal developmental goals with their professional developmental goals, with their family goals. Folks have kids that they need to put through college, and oftentimes that is very, very difficult when you're working for the government. And so there are folks who may avail themselves of the opportunity to work in private industry, increase their salary to the point where they can be able to afford to put their children through college or whatever their personal and financial objective is. And then once that goal is attained, they would have an obligation to go back to federal government and complete their service there. So there are a lot of bold ways and creative ways that we can work around this problem. And I think we have a lot of creative minds, both in government and private industry, that if we were actually committed to solving the problems, we could come up with far more creative solutions than the one that I just posed.
It strikes me also, Carl, that the hybrid solution that you're proposing and the way you describe it there might have other benefits. I know there are other countries that have similar hybrid models that get actually a lot of benefit for innovation for government services, where people are going to the private sector for a period of time with ideas of how to start up startups to actually go serve some of these needs that they understood because they were in government. Chris, Caroline, any further thoughts on this particular issue?
No, I agree with everything that Carl said. I think, we do need to be bold. I think we can look at hybrid models. I mean, it's a really tough nut to crack. I mean, we've gone so far as to actually take individuals out of government and then go to federal judges to see if we can get letters of marque for cyberspace to allow them to go out like privateers and actually defend critical assets that may otherwise not be covered by government authorities. And so I think that there is a way to be bold in how we facilitate the transfer of that talent back and forth. But, Carl, I think, it's certainly, something to think about and, something to continue to push forward. It's a question that continues to not be answered. As I said, I mean, we've for 15 years now been talking about the millions of unfilled jobs. And we look at areas, inside of government like Cyber Command, where they're just spending so much time building stuff, rebuilding stuff, going through the very basics of what we need in terms of our infrastructure to be able to carry out cyber operations. And that is both, a sophisticated task, but a lot of times it's a very menial task that takes a ton of time. And so that level of training and retention, I think needs to increase. And for the most part, what we see inside of government for those individuals that want to stay there, they're there for really two reasons. They get to do the coolest stuff with the authority of government, and they get to work with other A players. And you don't always find that on the private sector. And so being more effusive about that, making that cool, making that sexy, that is something that I think government can do a really good job at. Those true cyber warriors. I mean, who is the Neil Armstrong of cyberspace?
That's great. We have another question from online?
I had a quick question. Thank you all for coming. This is a super interesting panel, but you all spoke a lot about collaboration and investment we can do between the two sectors, but beyond consulting and the expertise that the private sector just does bring in, what are some more concrete examples we can be working on, and rather than beyond that?
So other ideas of where private sector
Right, beyond like
play a
personnel
real
and
role beyond consulting and coming
Exactly.
to be sort of workforce enhancers within government.
right.
Ideas, Caroline?
Sure. I mean, I think there's tremendous value in industry interacting with government whenever they're thinking about, future regulations. A great example right now is the ICTS interim final rule. Is the Information and Communication Services and Technology Supply Chain interim final rule. This has the potential to be quite broad sweeping in terms of evaluating any transaction. Any transaction is broadly defined. It's not just an M&A transaction. A download could be considered a transaction coming from certain foreign adversaries, which have been defined to include the usual suspects, Russia, China, Iran, et cetera. There's a lot of interaction with industry right now about what that role should look like, what a licensing regime should look like. And so there's the traditional formal comment period when industry companies are allowed to submit formal written comments to the government to say, hey, this is going to be really tough, for us to work with. Here are some other suggestions. And then there's also ample opportunity for informal dialogue back and forth with the government. So it's a two-way street. And the government, especially with this particular rule that's coming out of the Commerce Department, they really want to hear from industry, how can we make this work? Is this feasible? And they're looking for solutions to come from the private sector to the Commerce Department and other agencies so that they can craft a best solution.
Carl, Chris, other examples?
The first.
No, go ahead, Carl.
Sorry. The first example that comes to mind in my area is insider threat programs, just as an example. Government agencies have their own insider threat programs, as do most commercial companies, most private companies, private industry. And I have connected some commercial contacts who run insider threat programs for their companies with some of my federal government clients so that they can share those ideas about best practices. I do think it's a two-way street because I think private industry has a lot of great best practices, but so does the federal government. And so in areas, and I'm just using insider threat as one example, in that arena, for instance, it's very beneficial to both sides to have that interaction, to trade those best practice ideas, to better understand the threats, and not just the technical solutions, but the people solutions as well. Because insider threat issues are as much focused on personnel resources as they are on technical resources. And so in an area like that, that exchange of ideas, I think benefits both sides. And that's just one of many examples where there are cutting edge ideas in private industry that would benefit government and vice versa.
And I would just add, I see lots of examples across the three different categories that I mentioned earlier of offensive, defensive, and surveillance, which I put in a different category. You could think of people who would play an offensive role as organizations like the very controversial Israeli company, the NSO Group, who develops a tool that has great capability and it sells it to, or license it to governments to be able to use. Creates all sorts of issues also, but in the right structure could play a huge benefit from an offensive perspective. From a surveillance perspective, I tend to think like the AI companies and analytics providers who can extract a lot more value out of data and what they're going to do. And from a defensive perspective, your traditional cybersecurity companies that are improving firewall technology or other technologies that can be employed beyond just coming in, helping provide consulting services to put the right processes in place. Other questions online or in the room? Let me move to my last question then. So the last couple of days, what's been going on in the Ukraine? I'm wondering, to what degree does this cast a different perspective over these private-public collaborations, particularly since we know that the public-private collaboration doesn't exist just here in the United States, but it also exists in Russia, it also exists in Ukraine. The Ukraine government has come and called out for entities other than other governments to come help them, particularly helping them in cyberspace. We saw just in the last 24 hours, the anonymous hacking group actually took down the RT website to come to the aid of the Ukraine. The level of complexity of what those relationships looks like and the way that they would intersect with the sanctions environment. Carolyn, I don't know how much you've thought about that, but what are the issues that the last couple of days have presented?
Well, I think the thing that's top of mind for everyone is what are going to be the retaliations for the sanctions, right? These are probably the most aggressive sanctions that the United States has ever done. These are very, very significant. We've sanctioned, banks like this before in the context of Iran, but not when we're dealing with a $3 trillion economy, right? So these are huge sanctions. And the risk right now is what are going to be the cybersecurity threats, coming from Russia? Are we going to expect attacks on critical infrastructure? The FIs, the banks right now are very, very concerned about that, as they should be. CISA has issued a number of advisories and warnings to industry and to the banks. There's constant dialogue going on with the banks right now, in particular, about how to ready themselves for such attacks. So I think that's the great unknown. That's the thing that's top of mind for everyone right now. And something that we need to be, on top of in the next few days, weeks, years.
Carl, thoughts on additional issues that the last couple of days have presented?
I think the last couple of days and the last few months have highlighted the fact that it is probably not a question of if, but a question of when, that there will be an attack either on government cybersecurity infrastructure or private cybersecurity infrastructure. And the owners of that infrastructure are the ones that are likely to recognize that malicious activity first. And so if you're the FBI and if you're CISA, you want private industry to be very vigilant about activities on their networks and to be reporting that activities on their networks so that CISA, the FBI, the Intel community, Cyber Command, and others have that intelligence and are able to, number one, mitigate the damage to those victims. Number two, identify the actors. Number three, disrupt those actors either by imposing risks and consequences online or prosecution or whatever the case may be. And also to be able to collect that intelligence from the victims that are the subjects of these malicious attacks and notify other potential victims, whether they're in the financial sector or anywhere else. I can tell you from past experience that organizations like the Bureau, like NSA, they are tracking these events 24/7 right now, collecting intelligence 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and disseminating that intelligence to other government agencies, to other nations, to other intelligence services, to other private industry companies. And so that flow of intelligence is critical in terms of protecting victim corporations and disrupting the threat. And so there is no more important time for that collaboration to occur than now.
That's great. And I know that General Dunlap likes to stay on time.
Yeah,
So
we
I
do.
think thank you guys all so much.
Thank you. It was a fascinating panel, and look forward to talking to you some more afterwards. Really, really well done. Okay, we'll be back at 3:00, and we'll have Rear Admiral Burt from the U.S. Coast Guard.
Thanks, Carl.
Thanks, everybody.